I'm gonna help you to avoid the 10 mistakes that every beginner filmmaker makes that will make their footage look very amateur. The first mistake is filming in all auto settings when instead you should have all of your camera settings in manual. When filming in all auto settings, you're not really learning how to use your camera to its fullest potential, and you're missing out on all of the creative choices that you can do with your camera. For example, using the different f-stops to control how much background blur you want to have in your shots. Overexposing or underexposing your footage. It always looks very unprofessional when your footage is significantly overexposed or underexposed. So you should always use the histogram and zebras if possible to measure and to see whether or not your footage is actually correctly exposed. If you're still uncertain whether or not your footage is properly exposed, it's always better to slightly underexpose your footage rather than overexposing your footage significantly, because it's easier to fix the footage and the exposure of the footage in post when you've slightly underexposed the footage. So that way you won't lose image quality as much as if you have overexposed the footage. Using the wrong frame rate. You should always film in 24 frames per second, not 30, not 60 frames per second. And the reason is that if you're going for that cinematic, filmic look, for over a century now, the movies that you see in the movie theaters have been filmed in 24 frames per second. And because of that, our eyes have become used to that frame rate, and because of that, it looks very natural and cinematic to our eyes, or should I say, pleasing to our eyes. Using the right shutter speed. Now, to get the correct shutter speed, you should always have your shutter speed set at double the frame rate. So if you're filming in 24 frames per second, your shutter speed should always be 1/48th of a second. But in most DSLRs and mirrorless cameras, you can only set it to 1/50th of a second, but that's honestly close enough. Here's an example. On the left side, we have a shot where I didn't set the shutter speed double the frame rate, but on the right side, we have a shot where I did set the shutter speed double the frame rate, and as you can see, there's a lot of motion blur, which makes it look natural and cinematic and more smooth. Using the wrong white balance. Now, the biggest problem with using the wrong white balance is that your footage might look way too magenta or way too green, which looks very unprofessional. But the biggest problem is that when you're filming a person, a subject, that person's skin tones might look very unnatural, and that's a dead giveaway of an amateur. Now, if you're a beginner filmmaker, what you can do is you can just use the preset white balance settings on your camera, for example, cloudy or sunny or shade, and that will be good enough for you. And then when you're more experienced, you can start to learn how to use the more advanced ways to get the perfect white balance for your shots. Not using proper lighting. Lighting is one of the most important things in filmmaking and making videos. For example, even if you have a budget camera, but you use proper lighting, you can make your footage look very professional with just using the right lighting techniques. Now, obviously, you don't need to buy these kind of expensive studio lights like I have, especially if you're just starting out. But for example, on Amazon, you can find proper lights that are good enough for your needs around $70 to $100, and those are more than good enough if you're just starting out. And if you can't afford buying lights, or for some reason you don't have lights at your disposal, you can just use natural light. Poor audio quality. Now here's the thing, people will tolerate video quality that's below average, but if the audio is horrendous, people will click away from the video within seconds. Cause the thing is that audio quality is at least half of the viewing experience. But the good thing is that in order to get good audio quality, you don't need to spend a lot of money. For example, the microphone that I'm using that's right over here, right out of the frame but very close to my mouth, cost only around $50. So if you use your microphone right, you don't need an expensive microphone. Shaky footage. A lot of beginner filmmakers have very shaky footage that's quite unpleasant to watch. But the good thing is that there's a lot of different ways that you can stabilize your footage. For example, you can just use something as simple as a tripod to make sure that the footage is stable, even though it's just a static shot. But for most situations, that's good enough. But you can also get something like a GorillaPod or even a gimbal, which would be the most ideal way to get stable footage if you want to get these kind of camera movements that you can't do otherwise. Not color grading your footage. Even if you're not very familiar with color grading, the least you can do is to make sure that before you press record, you have the right settings and you get everything nailed in camera so that you have very little to do to tweak the colors in post to make them look good. And you should at least add a LUT, which is kind of like an Instagram filter but for video, and it gives your footage a certain kind of look. No storytelling. Think about it this way. If you're going to watch a movie and it has a lot of cool looking action sequences that have nothing to do with each other and the movie has no plot and no kind of a story, would you watch the full movie? Probably not. So that's the reason why you should always have a beginning, a middle, and an ending in your film, in your video. If you're still watching, thank you. And if you enjoyed this video, then I highly recommend to watch either one of these videos somewhere here on the screen, because I think you're gonna enjoy it as well. Alright, thanks for watching and I'll see you again in the next video. Take care.